Did you know that there's a color our eyes can see that doesn't technically exist? It's called Stygian blue, and it's what's known as a chimerical color. These are colors that can only be seen when you stare at a saturated field of color. To see Stygian blue, you have to stare at a field of bright yellow for a long good time, and then immediately look at another field of black. It's a complicated process to explain why this happens, and we don't really understand it. We don't really understand a lot of things. I bring this up because it's important to understand that there are things that we see that don't technically exist. Sort of like how our brain compensates for movement by delaying the image we see by just a fraction of a second. I'd never really thought about any of this because it doesn't really matter. It's interesting, but it's not really important to everyday life. Especially not in my job. I can't really talk about what I do. It's not that it's classified or anything, but it's definitely a specialized field, and the last thing I need is for someone to know to read this and report it to my bosses, which they almost certainly would do. What we do, we have to be really mentally on our game, because if we're not, a lot of things can go wrong really quickly, and a lot of money can be lost. A lot of your money, frankly, since your taxes are going toward funding the things I need to do for my job. What I can tell you is that what I do involves me being out in the open ocean for long periods of time, in a very small submersible that is capable of going down a very, very long way. It sounds a lot more exciting than it is, I can promise you that, but it's an interesting job to say the least. Although, it's a lot more cramped in there than you would ever believe. This is not a job for the claustrophobic. It's also not a job for people that are easily scared, or prone to any kind of panic. I'm a level-headed guy, I don't scare easily, and I'm pretty small, so I was sort of uniquely suited for this work. I really enjoy it, actually. The only thing I don't like is what I want to talk to you guys about. Or I guess just give you a heads up about. We started noticing them about a year ago when I was doing some research at a pretty shallow depth, all things considering. At first we thought it was just some kind of weird camera anomaly because the pressure really messes with things down here. We have a camera mounted on a little arm that extends from the sub. There's a few arms that do different things, but the one with the camera is important because that's how we can record things like sulfur lakes near volcanoes, which is something we didn't even know existed until recently. But as I mentioned, the pressure can really take a toll on the equipment, and glitches are to be expected. But this particular problem, we were noticing it happening with a good amount of frequency, and it was almost always when we got below a very specific depth. It would start out small, and was pretty easy to write it off or work around it. But eventually, it would grow, and it would make shapes, really interesting ones that made it really difficult to pinpoint whether there was something physical happening. I'm not really sure there's words for the shapes we'd see, because offhand, I don't know that there are any. Irregular polygons is the closest we came, always with straight sides or right angles, which, again, made it hard to determine that it was a real event. The first time it popped up, I was taking some water samples near a hydrothermal vent because we wanted to know what kind of minerals were popping out of it. I noticed there was a dark spot on the right side of the camera's view, so I adjusted the lens and it went away for a little while. But it came back eventually, bigger, and I asked the surface if they were seeing it, which they were. It floated around, not coming too close to the arm of the sub or the vent, but it stayed in the general vicinity. I was down there for a while, and it stuck me with the whole time. When I went back up, we messed around with the camera and tightened up some things to see if that would fix the problem. But it didn't. These things kept popping up more and more. We never saw more than one at a time, but just about every dive we went on, we were seeing them. irregular polygons with this color that it took me months to find a name for. Stygian blue. That impossibly dark color that's somehow even darker than black. When we figured out that they were really there, which took us quite a bit of time, the only thing we could figure out was that they were kind of weird sea life that we hadn't seen before. Of course we were reporting this stuff, and when we were able to prove that they were physically there by moving the arms of the sub in front of them, we ended up getting a grant to study them a bit more. And that's when we started seeing what they could really do. Now at this point, when we got the grant, we had never been able to go near one, because when we tried, they would move away. Again, that was one of the things that helped us figure out that the things were aware. Not necessarily intelligent, but at least somewhat aware of their surroundings. But because we couldn't get near them, we couldn't tell how big they were, what they were made of, or why they were so impossibly dark. That was something that really perplexed us. What were these things made of that was so impossibly dark? We started doing night dives to see if maybe they were bioluminescent. They weren't, but somehow we could still see them. They were so dark that they stood out from the background. If you've learned anything about the ocean, you know that there's a point where absolutely no light can penetrate. We went down that far, turned off all our running lights, and we could still see them. Always one at a time, always a different shape, and they were always completely alone. That was something that one of the guys at the surface pointed out. We never saw any kind of other life go anywhere near these things. Before we started doing night dives, we would stick to the shallower areas and we would see if a lot of life near the events. But whenever these things came around, anything else in the general area would clear out. It seemed that these things were predators because the prey fish and other small creatures got the hell out of there. But for the longest time, we never saw them eat. It took us a while, but eventually we figured out how to get near them. The trick we found was to kill the running lights and let the sub basically go dead in the water. The only things we would leave running were the absolute bare bones, the things we couldn't turn off for any reason. Once we did that, they would come closer. The first one that did it was a fascinating shape, like a square with little triangles cut out in arbitrary places, all right angles with no other form. It came up to the sub and circled it a few times, and we agreed it was checking us out. It paused in front of the camera at one point, and we got some amazing shots of it. At that distance, we could see that whatever it was, it had almost no density. It never turned its back on us because the positioning of the cutouts didn't change. No matter what angle we viewed it from, it always looked the same. When we attempted to touch it with one of the arms, it took off. Not terribly fast, but at a good enough clip we realized that it had to have some kind of propulsion. And what that was, we still don't know. They're sensitive to electricity, I think, but they got bolder the more we were down there with them. And they started to follow us as they realized we weren't afraid. We started referring to them as pollis because we didn't know what else to call them. We started playing little games with them. We would have them follow us to the surface where we would move the sub around and have them chase us. We got really fond of them, even though we didn't know what they were. We didn't have a clue. But they seemed to pose no threat to us or anything else. They were almost cute. On a mid-afternoon dive, a school of baitfish came through the area while we were interacting with one of the pollis. The school went around us, but a few fish got separated and passed right by us. As we watched, one fish broke off from the rest and swam very calmly right up to the polly. It almost seemed like it was lured to it by something, and the second it hit the surface of the polly, something happened. The polly gained density. That's the only way I can describe it. The fish fell into the polly, and in a fraction of a second it was crushed by some unbelievably great force into nothing. The only thing I've ever seen like it is the footage of the crab being sucked into a millimeter-wide crack of a pipe. 1 second the fish was there, the next it was compressed and was gone. Needless to say, we were both intrigued and alarmed. Looking back on it, I'm sure this was a deliberate display of what the polly was capable of doing. Things began to go downhill from there. Several physicists were called to help us because we all agreed that whatever had taken place was way beyond anything we had ever seen. No one could explain the footage we had shot. There was a lot of talk of some kind of weapon, that it was something man-made. I'm not sure if we failed to notice it before, or if we were allowed to see it. But the pollies started popping up everywhere, and much more frequently. When we dove to the seafloor, we would find them laying flat on the sand, capturing and crushing whatever got near them. They would float by us in the water, never coming close, but always staying within sight range. And they began to get bigger. Soon, we were seeing pollies bigger than the sub. Bigger than seals, bigger than some species of whales. The variety and sizes were endless, never the same. People on the project started getting scared. The pollies never attacked us, but we began to get the sense that we were being surrounded. There were so many. We were losing count of how many we were seeing. They were devouring the bait we would bring down, opening themselves up and crushing the things inside them in fractions of the second. We started bringing rocks coated with a frozen layer of chum to see what would happen, and the pollies crushed them with no problem. We tried the same experiment with steel, concrete, a very small piece of industrial-grade diamond. Everything we threw into them, they crushed. The last night of the project, there was an accident. As the sub was lowered into the water, a member of the crew got too close to one of the lines, and they got snagged. On the camera feed, we watched them hit the water. Another crew member threw a life ring down, and I moved the sub away as quickly as I could. As I did this, the camera arm moved, and the screen was filled with that color. That impossible Stygian blue. The polly, which was twice the size of the sub, rushed up from below me and headed straight for the crew member who didn't see it coming. I radioed surface to get him up, to get him out of the water, but in the fraction of a second it took to do that, the polly touched him. I watched his leg fall into the polly, where it swung as if suspended in air, and in a fraction of a second, it was gone. The stump of his leg was wrinkled, like the end of a sausage. I don't even know that he had time to feel it before the polly took him up to the chest. It crushed him, and from the surface, I could hear people screaming. I didn't see his face, but from what I gather, the force was so great that in the instant the polly crushed him, what remained of his lungs was forced up out of his mouth. The pressure must have been immense. All of his remaining blood and tissue rocketing up into his throat, blasting out the sinus cavities and into the brain. I have to believe he was killed instantly. The rest of him collapsed down to the polly, and in the split second, I saw his head. I saw the scalp was split open at the top, and then he was gone, and the polly sank back down until I couldn't see it anymore. We haven't been allowed to dive anymore since then. We're heading back to the mainland, where we'll probably be debriefed. I can't imagine they'll let us keep our footage, and I imagine we'll all be required to keep tight-lipped about this until we know exactly what these things are. At night, when I go out on deck and look down, I can see them following us, just below the surface. It's amazing how clearly they stand out from the water, I would have never known that there could be anything darker than the ocean at night. Until we know what they are. Until we can figure out how to keep them away and we can confirm that they don't exist anywhere else, I don't know if I'll feel safe. Because from what we can tell, they don't need water to survive. From what we can tell, the only reason they're in the water is because that's what covers most of our planet. I really, really hope we're wrong. But for now, all I can do is warn everyone and advise that whatever you do, you avoid the open water. Please avoid open water.